Good day and welcome to the Music Survival Guide podcast, where we teach young Padawans to the ways of music promotion. That fell down very quickly. Joe, how are you?
I'm alright, mate. That was your most interesting introduction so far. How are you, mate?
I'm doing really good. I've got full on into the Christmas spirit. Hurrah. I'm one of those people. So we have a lovely little tradition where on the 1st of December we put up our tree and then we watch something vaguely Christmassy but not entirely Christmassy. So this time it was Oliver the musical.
So Die Hard.
No, Oliver the musical. Old school.
Die Hard's a Christmas film.
I've not actually seen Die Hard.
You're kidding.
No, I'm not. I know.
Well, I know what I'm going to buy you for Christmas.
Oh, a joyous Christmas film.
I was going to say, do you play Whamageddon?
I do play Whamageddon. I do indeed,
you still in?
And I'm currently winning. Yeah. Are you in?
I'm still in. I got really nervous because I heard the intro to Mariah Carey's "All I Want for Christmas" in a shopping centre, and I got nervous, so I had to leave immediately.
The temptation to just ruin it for myself and put a clip on this podcast is very high, but then we might get sued for
Copyright infringement.
That's the one. So maybe let's not do that. Anyway, Joe, what are we talking about this week?
So today we're talking about something that isn't touched upon that much, but I think is something I see too much. I don't see a lot, but I definitely see it too much, and that is studio meltdowns.
Oh. What might you mean exactly by a studio meltdown? What might one look like, for want of a better phrase?
So I think what I'd describe as the Hollywood depiction of a studio meltdown would be, arguments and beers being thrown around, someone getting hit on the back of the head with a Les Paul, that kind of thing. But I think more as an overarching theme, we just kind of want to help people not fall into the trap of having those small, petty arguments that can turn into big arguments or disagreements in the studio.
Yeah, that's fair. Because it seems to be the phrase that I come back to again and again. In the studio, time is money. And time that you spend as a band having a disagreement is time that you've wasted not recording something. So avoiding that is preferable, I would say.
Yeah, there's as well to add to that is with the whole budget thing is obviously a lot of people that are listening to this podcast are on limited budgets. You can't afford the 3-month studio stint to write and record a single. You've got to be in and out pretty quickly. So trying to avoid those small arguments that kind of eat up time, because I don't think people appreciate how much time it does eat up. Even if they're only small minor ones, they do eventually add up together, and you kind of look back and you go, oh wow, we spent half the day actually arguing about what we're going to have for lunch.
That strikes me as a waste of time. There we are. I mean, as a mixing engineer more than a recording engineer, I don't see much of this, but I imagine, Joe, you see more of it. Not necessarily all the time, but a fair bit.
No, I think like I said before, I see too much of it. I think the massive thing with studio meltdowns is they're all avoidable. Every single one of them is avoidable. But unfortunately, some measures are taken that means that they do come about.
Yeah. So I guess a lot of arguments, being a married man, I can attest to this, a lot of arguments come down to communication or miscommunication in reality. So I guess, making sure that you all have agreeable ways of communicating and that you understand each other is a really great start in the studio.
I think it's really important to have great communication, like you said, really in any facet of life, but especially when it comes to working in the studio, because like you allude to there, being in a band is kind of like being in a very weird relationship. You pretty much are in each other's pockets. I know from personal experience, some of the studio situations I go into, we live together for the month where you're recording. If that, isn't a weird kind of relationship. I don't really know what is.
Sounds quite intense.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best phrase for it. Like, you can spend 18 hours a day in the studio together, which again is a stressful environment because you've got budgets involved. There are people, like producers and engineers like myself who have kind of constantly got to keep one eye on the clock whilst trying to be creative. And people bring all kinds of stresses into the studio. So having that kind of communication and laying everything out beforehand and not letting things bubble under is really, really important.
Yes, 100%. I am sure that Joe has thought about recommending this book yet again, but How to Win Friends and Influence People, or How to Win Friends and Influence People in the Digital Age, is 100% applicable. That is a book all about effective communication and how to not waste time, I would say. And if you haven't read it, read it. I am most of the way through it because I'm an incredibly slow reader, but I'm taking it in, and it is honestly amazing.
I'm glad the recommendation stuck.
Oh, yes.
So like we've mentioned just before, there's the notion of budgets and all that kind of thing. But I want to move slightly away from that and just kind of discuss the knock-on effect on creativity. So when you're heading into the studio, or especially if you're heading into the studio for the first time, it can be quite a scary experience. I'm sure Phil will agree with this, that for the first time, your playing might come under scrutiny. And I mean that in the nicest way possible, that if you're working with a great producer, they're going to try and get the best performance out of you. So they might kind of say, oh, can you maybe just try this, that, and the other? You're going to have other bandmates who are here, especially, say, for example, if you're a drummer, you're going to have your bandmates that are hearing your parts in high fidelity for the first time and are able to kind of make creative, constructive criticism. So it can be quite a nerve-wracking experience. And I think part of the reason why I see a lot of studio meltdowns is it is a build-up of those nerves, and taking that into consideration when you're communicating and talking to people in the studio is really important. Giving them a bit of leeway. If, maybe someone's a little bit snappy, it's because, they were tossing and turning the night before and couldn't get to sleep because they're really stressed out about recording, or that, there's loads of things that are going on. So just kind of having that consideration, that ability to just take a step back when needed, I think is really important when it comes to studio etiquette.
I think an important thing to do is to make sure you have these kinds of conversations about your sort of worries and potential kind of thoughts around it before you enter the studio. Because as we said, once you enter the studio, the clock is ticking, as pressured as that sounds. So making sure that you have those conversations before you enter the studio in a pub or, whatever kind of social setting you enjoy as a band. That's a great place to have a great time to have a long conversation about these things.
Yeah, there's an element as well where I'd say you need to clear two things. You need to clear any social issues. So if you do have things bubbling up, i.e. some members maybe not owing money to various things, or, even the smallest of personal grievances, those things need to be ironed out. And also as well, I see it more than I should, is actually sitting down, and this is maybe a conversation to have with your engineer and producer as well, and outlining what you actually want to achieve. The amount of times where I see bands going in and the drummer thinks they're doing these 3 songs and the guitarist thinks they're doing these 2 songs, and then they just, they spend an hour or two having an argument about which song should be recorded, which in itself, like Phil mentioned, is going to eat at your budget. And then everyone's in a bad mood afterwards. If you've employed a producer, you can kind of, put them on the spot somewhat. I know with my style is I like to get myself really familiar with the songs before I go in. So if you suddenly turn around and go, oh, yeah, we're now doing these songs instead, it can totally throw everyone involved. So outlining those two things, and I'd even recommend having it down in writing so that like that everyone's agreed upon. It doesn't need to be like a legal contract or whatever. That's just daft. But if you kind of go, right, we're going to work on these songs and this needs to be done, and we really hope we come out with this in the end. And
Yeah.
managing expectations, I think, is the best bracket to put that under.
Great phrase. Managing expectations. Sort of thinking entirely practically on a similar note, if you manage to agree the songs before you enter the studio, exactly which ones you're going to do, it will mean that everyone has had proper time and space to rehearse those songs. Going into the studio, making sure you actually know your parts inside out, upside down, backwards, is essential for a really good and smooth recording. Because I think another point of tension is people not having rehearsed the parts. And I can imagine a conversation coming up of, well, you've had time, you know these songs, why can't you play it? And that's just such an easy little thing that you can remove as a point of tension if you just make sure everyone's rehearsed the music.
To a certain extent as well, I'd extend that to just general instrument care, and I'd even bring that into like vocals as well. So, you know, someone could bring in their drum kit that looks like it's been under heavy military artillery fire for the last 5 years, and then they expect it to sound great at the end, and then you've got one band member who's got, you know, guitar in perfect intonation, it's just come out of the workshop and it's ready to record. So if you kind of outlay what everyone needs to do beforehand, and this is not a conversation to have 24 hours beforehand, by the way.
Oh, no.
This is something that you need to start considering as soon as you look into recording time.
Yes. And I mean, if you're kind of worried about costs, because I know different instruments cost different amounts to upkeep. As a, you know, if you were just a singer, then upkeeping a voice is probably a heck of a lot cheaper than upkeeping a drum kit. Think about spreading out the cost, sort of working out the total cost for everyone in the band and spreading that out. It almost sounds obvious to say that, but that could be a point of tension that you remove in the band before you're even in the studio.
Yeah, it could be worth having a band budget. So when you're setting out to do recording, unfortunately, in some circumstances, I see people go, right, okay, well, we'll pay for this now. And then kind of that will get sorted in a little bit. And then we'll think about mixing and then we'll pay that. But if you kind of go, right, our budget is X per song, find a mixing engineer that we want to work with. Right, okay, he's going to be that much. Studio is going to be that much. Mastering engineer is going to be X amount. And then you kind of go, okay, let's now split that 5 ways. And in that budget, you include fresh drum skins, spare guitar strings, spare bass strings, and whatever's required really to get the song out there. Because you're all, you know, in most situations, you're gonna split the profits evenly.
So why not split the costs?
Yeah. So why not? Yeah, exactly.
And another really, really important little point about sort of instrument upkeep is a good quality and well looked after instrument is absolutely thoroughly essential for a good recording. There's a sort of, I've seen them all over the internet, a hierarchy of what's important in a recording studio to get a good record. And as much as Joe and I love to nerd out over microphones and compressors and all these exciting things, honestly, they're not as important as a good, well-kept-up instrument. You could take a really amazing sounding acoustic guitar that's been cared for and looked after and has fresh strings and has been set up properly, and you could put it in front of the cheapest microphone and it would probably sound better than a really battered, cheap guitar that has been put in front of the world's most expensive setup. Yeah,
it's a thing of a crap-sounding drum kit recorded really expensively. It's just a really high-definition crap-sounding drum kit. If anything, it just makes it sound even worse because you now notice all the horrible bits rather than just some of the horrible bits about it. So I'd also like to add a great solution to this, and again, it's a case of managing expectations and preparing, is if you are sitting there and thinking, right, we're going into the studio and it's our first time. I'm not sure what we're going to need for the studio. What expectations does the engineer have of us to bring? Speak to the engineer. Send them a message. Every band I work with, when they're mostly custom, but it's 80% of just the template that I use, is every band I work with, I kind of say, right, okay, well, you give me, and we're talking like a month and a half before we head into the studio. I say, give me a rundown of everything you've got. So they will kind of go, we've got this guitar, this amp, blah, 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 blah. And I'll go, okay, well, what you will need to do is you'll need to get this set up. You need to get fresh heads for this. You need spare of that, blah, blah, blah. And then if they do come in and, they say to me beforehand, we really want this guitar tone, like really want this chorus effect, but I see they haven't got it written down, I can bring my chorus effect with them and I can communicate that to them. There's nothing worse than them turning up and them going, which has happened, where I've been in-house engineers at previous studios and bands have turned up and they've gone, right, okay, well, where's your drum kit? And I go, we don't have a drum kit. So it's having that communication and setting an expectation for what's needed and enough time to prepare for that expectation is really, really important.
Yes. I can tell you, if you are sort of nervous about the idea of approaching your recording engineer or producer or whoever it is before you're in the studio, because you think, oh, I don't know what they'll say, don't worry about it. Any producer worth their salt will gladly have a conversation with you about your equipment and what's needed and what you might need to do, because ultimately it's going to make the recording engineer's life easier. They'll get a better record and everyone will have a better time.
Yeah, I'd much rather have the lengthy phone, or not even lengthy, but the phone conversation a month before about what they need to bring, rather than having that conversation in the studio with them and then them realizing, oh crap, we can't do this now then. That is a much worse conversation to have as an engineer and producer.
Yes.
Okay, so I feel like I should have referenced this when you brought up the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, is I think something I see quite a bit from being CC'd in emails. Sometimes I question if I'm supposed to be CC'd in them. I feel like they definitely didn't intend to. Is a lot of arguments can happen over via text and email because a lot of nuance is lost. So what can come across as just a general message, someone might interpret as aggressive or trying to be mean. So what I'd recommend is, if possible, try and have as many of those conversations over the phone or in person. It's just a much more effective form of communication, especially if you're going to have a difficult a difficult conversation where you've got to kind of convince someone, say, hey, well, I don't really feel like you're paying the right amount of money for this, or turns out you actually owe me 50 quid or something like that. Those conversations are much better to have in person or over the phone rather than text.
And they're probably, if they're sort of band member to band member, they're probably not the kind of arguments you should be airing in front of the producer. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that you should put up an image to your producer, but there are some arguments and band things that producers probably don't need to see. And if it's, you owe me X amount of money, that might be one of them. Might be worth thinking about.
Yeah, it doesn't instill confidence if they also owe you an invoice as well. If they're having that conversation in front of you and you're going, oh, I don't fancy my chances of getting paid after this then.
So Joe, if you're working with a band, how would you recommend that kind of communication between producer and band? What would that look like?
So it can depend from producer to producer. And I think part of the selection process that you're working with when you're deciding on who to go with the producer is how they communicate with you. You don't necessarily want someone who's more shut off, or you might want to, I don't know, because the bands that work with me know that they're going to get someone who really likes talking about the project, wants to kind of get ideas out there, wants it to feel like an environment where no ideas are going to be immediately shut down. So everyone gets to say. It for me, that's just more conducive to being a creative person. I don't want it to feel like no one is afraid of certain people and they've got to set certain standards. So yeah, I think there's one thing to always bear in mind is as a producer, they're also trying to be creative. You want the environment for them to be a friendly one. You want them to feel like they're they're welcome. And I know it sounds daft, and there's people who will say, "Oh well, it's their job. They're getting paid. They should get on with it." But ultimately, you want them at their best, and they
Yes.
will work at their best if you make the environment a great one to work in. So having, a friendly approach and an open approach to ideas is much more conducive to getting a better record than a scary or intimidating one.
So I guess what you're suggesting is if you're a band and you're looking for someone to produce or record your next EP or album, you're looking as much for the style of production they do, as much as that is important. You're also suggesting that bands look for the kind of approach that the producer has, something that fits their style and their way of working.
Yeah, I'd agree with that entirely. There's pretty much every example of bands I've produced or worked with. If possible, I'll always meet them before even giving them a quote. I'll always just go for a coffee and a chat and just get to know them. Because also, there's something to consider that if they're a great producer, and I hope people are working with great producers, is they want to know if they want to work with you as well. They don't necessarily have to work with you if you're working with someone you're really, really excited about and they've got great credits. They can pick and choose who they work with. And like this podcast is basically all about, we talk to each other. So if you're horrible to one producer or one engineer, it'll get round.
People will know.
And if you're not, a nailed on number ones, or massive fortune producing record artist, then people might start to kind of blank the emails and decide to opt maybe not to work with you. I hate to say it, but I have seen it happen.
Yeah. And different producers very much have different styles. So probably one of the most incredible and weird stories that I've heard is the producer of Slipknot. I think a lot of Slipknot is produced by this one guy. And he has this super aggressive approach to working with Slipknot especially. So he will quite literally throw chairs at them. There were the singer, I think, one of the band members had a song about cheating on his wife, and then he made the singer sing this song while staring at his wife.
Oh my God.
So if you want that, there are producers out there that do that, but I would suggest that depending on the kind of music you are, you may find that more or less conducive to getting a good recording.
I just want to say this now. I will never do that.
You won't throw a chair at someone.
No. I've never thrown a chair at someone.
Do it
I think
better.
I once accidentally, someone would describe it as aggressively, threw a Kit Kat at a singer, but I was genuinely just trying to...
That's a very, very British version.
I was just genuinely trying to pass him a Kit Kat, and I just didn't realise how hard I threw it.
Wow. It's a different level, that, isn't it?
So that's pretty much as aggressive as working with me gets.
That's fair. So, Joe, sorry, this is kind of me throwing more questions at you, just because you produce bands and I sit at home and mix.
Go for it.
So, if you picture the scene, sort of, you're in the studio, and obviously the clock's ticking, and there's a full band meltdown. It's kind of all happening, and there's a blazing round between a couple of the band members, and the other band members are sitting around awkwardly, not really knowing what to do or where to look. How does the situation get diffused quickly? Because you want to get on with it as a band, and you want to get a great record, but the clock's ticking. So how would you, as a producer, approach trying to diffuse the situation?
So I think that depends on a few things. If it's a band I know and I've worked with a few times and maybe, have relationships going back a few years, then I think you can let's be honest, the dynamics, who the leaders are of that band. You can take them to one side and kind of go, right, mate, time's ticking, this budget's going. I'm not particular, in my position, I'm not going to start throwing a hissy fit or whatever, but they're not going to achieve what they set out to achieve if they keep on arguing, and it's not going to turn out anywhere near as good either.
No.
So, and I think, to be honest, the same approach would go for any band that I'd maybe try and just have a word with one of them, or maybe just all of them at the same time, and kind of just try and communicate that I say, well, it sounds almost primary school teacher of me, but it's their time they're wasting at this stage. There's no detention involved, but I just don't. My fear would be that they look back on this and go, "Oh, we didn't make the most of it," because ultimately it's amazing. Recording in a studio is, if you have correct communication, you found the right producer, and the songs are great. It's honestly, it's why I think, it's one of the best jobs in the world, because it's so fun. So it almost kind of breaks my heart when you see people fighting and wasting the amazing opportunity that they have to be in a room, often with their best mates, and just make a record, make a piece of art with their friends. So yeah, I think it's just kind of about trying to communicate that if it's something that needs to be sorted now, then get it sorted as quick as possible. And if it's something that can be sorted later, just shelve it as quickly as possible. There's also an element as well, and the same goes not necessarily for a fight, but also in the recording process, is one of my nightmares, and I'm 99% sure I've never had a situation like this because I'm so conscious of it, is you can get in a studio, record, 3 days later, the rhythm guitarist goes, "I never really liked that. Didn't really like what that was happening. Blah, blah, blah." Nightmare scenario for a producer, because there's nothing you can do. And then they, as far as they're concerned, it's the rest of the band, the studio, the producer's fault. It's everyone's fault. So although I personally try and take it upon myself to make sure that if there's a quieter member of the band, then I always ask, what do you think about this? And sometimes it's about kind of gauging, are they happy to do it in front of the rest of the band, or do I just kind of need to catch them when it's just them? I'm not going to send out the other members. You have to be subtle about it, and just kind of, if you catch them in the kitchen area, just kind of go, "How do you feel this is going?" And sometimes they come out with, there's a anecdote of a band that I will make, remain nameless, that the bass player was really quiet, and I caught him halfway through the session, and I was just like, "Oh, hey, how's it going?" And he was like, "Yeah, it's good. It's going all right. I think I really like, I wish I could have done this." And I was like, "What do you mean?" He was like, "Oh, I wish I had this idea for this song." I was like, I didn't know. I said, "Well, everyone else is on a lunch. Should we go try it?" Went and tried it. Rest of the bandmates came back. It was amazing. It was the best part of the song. So if you don't actively ask and make sure that other people are involved, and make sure that it's, as much their project as it is everyone else's, I'm not saying that you have to immediately take that idea. So if they do have a pants idea, it can be pants and everyone can reject it, but at least then they kind of go away going, "Well, I had that idea, but it was pretty pants, and at least we tried it," rather than them going, "I had this idea, and if we had done that, it would have been amazing. It would have been our best song ever. But because the producer or the rest of the bandmates wouldn't hear about it, I'm going to get in a huff about it for the next year or so."
True. That's exactly right. And I think another thing which I don't think we've directly mentioned is when you are recording, emotion plays, and the emotions of the person playing play a massive part in the quality of the take, especially with singers, but also with any musician. So if you're trying to do, a really happy and uplifting song, and you're in a really bad mood because you've had an argument, it's going to affect the way you play in really subtle ways. And it's just something worth thinking about, that you really do need to create a kind of atmosphere conducive to the music that you're making.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. There's also just like a really small thing, and I know I was an assistant and an intern. I've seen pretty much every producer and engineer do this. Don't take offense if people ask you to leave the studio. And I don't mean that in a horrible way, but if someone's nervous, especially singers if they're doing it for the first time, the last thing they want to feel like is a zoo animal on the other side of the glass where they've got, the rest of their bandmates with their head pressed against it. They've brought their 2 photographer mates, and you've got an engineer and a producer and an assistant and an intern, the intern's nan, the family dog, and you've got about 600 people in the control room. It can feel like a really daunting experience, especially if, like Phil was saying, you're doing this, heart-wrenching vocal that's about like your first breakup or whatever, and you've suddenly got everyone like, crowding around and making you feel horrible. Don't be offended if people say, if the producer says, I think it's just best if it's me and the singer for now. Just, go get a cup of tea, go for a bit of lunch or whatever, come back, and then, you can check it over and we can maybe do some more work on it if nobody's happy. But that always tends to get the best results, is if someone feels nervous, maybe just send the rest of the band out. Because it's also, vocals are by far the hardest one to do via Parliament. There's nothing worse than, because vocal takes are so subjective, there's nothing worse and, confidence damaging than a person does one take and the talkback goes on, and then you've got 3 people saying, oh, well, can you do it like this? And then you've got another member going, oh, can you do it like that? And another member goes, oh, well, that wasn't very good. Can you do it like this? If you say that within one take and it feels like you've kind of got the whole world against you, you're not going to improve.
No. Might get worse. To be honest, that's enough to make anyone nervous, especially if there's loads of people there that make me nervous. Well,
Yeah.
To be honest. So I guess to sum up the topic, at least from my point of view, I'm sure Joe will have his fancy points or something like that. If you've got potential points of conflict as a band, make sure you discuss those before you enter the studio, before the clock is ticking. Make sure you rehearse your parts so you know what you're doing. Make sure you carefully choose your producer or recording engineer so that you're going to have a really conducive and productive relationship with them, and be open to ideas, and be open to any suggestions that person may have, or any other band member may have.
Yeah, I can't disagree with any of those points. The only one I'd really highlight is just being open. Just the best form of communication is just kind of allowing as much communication as possible. Obviously, with the caveat of if it's going to be argumentative communication, try having that as much as possible and clearing the air before the studio. Try not to go in with any arguments.
And then happiness will ensue.
And then, then you'll get the best product. I promise you you will, unless, you Slipknot and you like having chairs being thrown at you.
I don't know if they like it, but it happens.
Yeah. I'm not sure I'll be employing those methods.
Give it a go. Go on.
I'm now also worried that every band I work with that will hear this is going to expect me to be carrying Kit Kats at me at all times.
Joe Kit Kat Sage. That's what we'll call you.
Don't. I've got enough nicknames as it is. Let's not get into that.
So that was Music Survivor Guide podcast episode 12, Avoiding a Studio Meltdown. It will help you and help your bands. If you want to get in contact with us, then you can find Joe at nevisaudio.com, or you can contact me at phil@vortissoundstudios.com. These are all in the show notes, by the way. Or you can contact us both at Music Survival Guide Podcast at gmail.com. I think that's the email address. It will be in the show notes. We have a little Facebook group, which is called the Music Survival Guide Podcast. Come and join. The vote for our 2 opposing £1,000 home studio rigs is open. Please do vote, because I want to win. We will see you next time.
Take care.
Bye.